Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Board of Pharmacy's webinar today. I'm Tom Glinski, Chief Inspector with the Board of Pharmacy. But before we get started with the webinar, a few slides to go over with you about the setup of the webinar. All participants are in listen-only mode. If you have any trouble with audio through your computer, there is an option on the GoToWebinar toolbar that you may switch to telephone, and it gives you dial-in instructions. If you have any trouble, you can switch over to that and dial in. Today's program has been approved for CE from the board. In order to get CE, you must be signed in under your own username on the GoToWebinar system. I'll give more instructions at the end of the webinar about the CE. We have handouts posted in 2 spots for the webinar. You can find them at the board's website under our upcoming events tab. There's a link to handouts, and then they're also on your GoToWebinar toolbar. Down at the bottom, there's a tab that says handouts. If you open that up, you'll see a PDF of today's handouts. We do make recordings of our webinars, and you can find all past webinars on the board's website under news, publications, and resources. And I'm now going to turn it over to our Executive Director, Kimberly Grinston, to introduce the program and today's presenters.
Thank you, Tom, and good afternoon, everyone. As Tom mentioned, I am Kimberly Grinston, Executive Director for the Board of Pharmacy. And on behalf of the board, we'd like to welcome all of you to today's webinar. It is our pleasure to present this very important topic on today. I think we have truly lived through over the last year and a half now, what really has been an unprecedented time. The demand on healthcare workers has increased exponentially over these last several months. The board frequently hosts webinars on different compliance and policy updates, and today's webinar is just as important. Most pharmacists tell me that they join pharmacy to help people. When I'm out in the community or at association groups, I don't think I've met a pharmacist who didn't tell me that they decided to become a pharmacist because they wanted to take care of people. Healthcare is a very busy place with a lot of demands. Some of those were before the pandemic, but COVID-19 didn't help and probably made it worse. You all are dealing with vaccines and prescriptions. You have patients, phone calls, technicians, the board sometimes, and then what may be happening in your personal and family life. Suicide rates in healthcare continue to be alarming. The board is alarmed. If I ask, I'm sure everyone on this call would probably tell me that they felt overwhelmed or overloaded even before the pandemic. We know you have to take care of patients. That is your job, but protecting your mental health and well-being is just as important, if not more so, than your everyday job. Today, our webinar will focus on mental health and suicide awareness. We want you to ask the question during this webinar, how are you doing? Whether you're a pharmacist, a technician, an intern pharmacist, a store manager, or maybe just someone dropping by on the webinar, I urge you strongly to actively listen and to use the resources and tools that will be provided today. Use them for yourself or maybe even for someone you know, someone who may be working with you or even someone at home. We'd like to thank our presenter today, Dr. Bart Andrews. He is Chief Clinical Officer for Behavioral Health Resources. Also, Dr. Shelby Lang, she's a psychiatric clinical pharmacist with the Missouri Department of Mental Health. We've brought in some great people to provide some really great information today, and I'm going to let them do that. So, Dr. Andrews, Dr. Lang, thank you, and we'll turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. And good afternoon, everybody. We're officially noon. Now we're going to see if I can get my technology to work, so bear with me. Right now, you should be seeing the PowerPoint, but not in presenter mode. Is that correct?
That is correct, Bart.
All right, now we're gonna see if we can go to presenter mode. How'd that work?
Very good. You're good to go.
All right, thank you for all that help, Tom. Very much appreciate it, and the practice was really helpful. So Shelby and I are here today to talk about suicide. It's something that I've been talking about every day of my life for the better part of the last 23 years. And to be honest, I think it's something we need to talk a lot more about. The interesting thing, people ask me, well, isn't it depressing or morbid to talk about suicide all the time? And it's the opposite, to be quite honest. What we know about suicide is actually helps us understand what are the most important parts of life, what are the most important aspects of life, what are the things that we should be emphasizing in life to make sure that people don't feel like they're in a place where they should kill themselves, where that's their only option. And it's great to have Shelby Lang with us. She is on our Suicide Prevention and Healthcare Echo. And it's so important that when we're talking to pharmacists about suicide prevention, that we have a pharmacist perspective. So I will start off and Shelby will pick up. Shelby, can you say hi to the folks?
Hey, everybody.
So we will tag team this, and first thing we'll do is we'll look at some quick objectives. It's important to, that we understand what suicide is. We actually have some pretty good theories of suicide, and knowing more about what drives people to suicide. Here's a secret: mental illness doesn't make people kill themselves. We'll talk more about that. We'll discuss risk elements specific to different populations. We'll talk about what we know about pharmacists and suicide. Answer is not much, but we'll talk about it anyway. We'll talk about things, tips and care when you're in crisis or when you're helping someone else in crisis. And then the amazing Shelby will talk about all this from a pharmacist perspective. First things first, we don't do very good at suicide prevention in this country. If you look at the rate of death of the primary killers of human beings in the United States of America, the suicide rate has been going up since 2000, with a little dip recently. Meanwhile, we've done an excellent job of bringing down fatalities and improving quality of life for people with chronic respiratory disease, people with cancer, people with heart disease, people with stroke. We've made substantial progress in reducing these primary killers of Americans. One of the reasons that we've made good progress is we spend a ton of money on research and services and delivery. And we don't do that with suicide. In fact, I'll give you an example. The federal government spends about $600 to $800 million a year, just the feds, on accident prevention, auto accident prevention. The feds spend about $70 million a year on suicide prevention. A fraction of what we spend even on auto fatalities. Now that number is going to be increasing soon because of 998 and some other things I won't bore you with. We still, the mental health system and suicide prevention in particular are grossly underfunded, and when you underfund things, it's hard to show impact. Now, what does that look like? Well, suicide is the 10th leading cause of death. In fact, behind it is kidney disease, and we spend about $2 billion a year on kidney disease, and less people die of kidney disease than suicide. And we spend $70 million on suicide. So you can see the disparity. Now, the suicide rate had been on the rise from 2000 until 2018. Each year was higher than the year before. We experienced our first decline in almost 19 years. In 2019, it dropped for the first time. And then during COVID, the suicide rate went down again. In fact, it went down substantially. There are experts like myself that predicted the suicide rate would go down during COVID. I am on record in multiple newspapers pointing that out. Despite that, the media tried to tell a story of doom and gloom and everybody's going to kill themselves because of COVID, and that's actually not what happened at all. The rate dropped, and it looks like the rate's continuing to drop. If there's anything you take away from our brief time today, is that suicide is incredibly complicated. You cannot explain it by one cause or another, and there are a tremendous number of factors that drive population levels of suicide, and those factors that drive population levels of suicide are often different than factors that drive individual suicide. It's an incredibly complicated topic. Let's look at some general population data real quick so you get a sense of this. For instance, in the United States of America, you can see we have very different populations for suicide risk. White Americans and Native Americans and Alaska Natives have very different risk profiles than other racial and ethnic groups. In fact, if you look at these two groups, at the top of the slide are white Americans and Native Americans, and at the bottom are all other groups. These are not the same population for risk level. They're incredibly different. At the same time, this doesn't mean people of color do not kill themselves. They most certainly do. In terms of the scope at population levels, they're very different. At the individual level, it makes little or no difference. In fact, one of the things that we do when we're working people to help prevent suicide at an intervention level, Don't worry about group data because at the individual level, it's absolutely meaningless. However, you can see at the group level, there's some stark differences between white Americans and Native Americans and non-white Americans and non-Native Americans. But even if we break Native Americans out from everybody else, you can see their risk profile looks really different. You'll see that with Native Americans, their risk profile peaks at a much younger age. People often think teens are at higher risk of suicide. In the general population, teens are one of our lower risk groups, believe it or not. In the Native American population, younger folks that are at much escalated risk, and then as they age, the rate tends to go down. The general population of Americans, starting following 2008 and the economic collapse, it used to be this looked like stairs, so that each age group that was older than the next had a higher suicide rate. That started changing around 2008, 2009. And now we see that if this middle-aged group, particularly starting in the mid-20s until the 60s, that's at increasing risk. And that definitely started changing following the economic collapse in 2008. So even when the rates of suicide look similar for whites and Native Americans, where the risk is peaking is different for Native Americans. The risk is peaking at younger ages, and it's peaking in middle ages for the general population. I am on the Missouri Suicide Prevention Network. We're very proud. The Missouri Suicide Prevention Network is only 3 years old, but we're working very hard to do a better job statewide in preventing suicide. And our data folks have pulled together some very specific Missouri data. You'll see some things that we won't go through all this, but some interesting things. 90% of suicides in Missouri are white Missourians. 90%. And whites make up about, I want to say 65% of the population of the state, 60%, something like that, maybe a little bit higher. So you can see that whites are disproportionately represented in the suicide rate. They make up 9 out of every 10 suicides in the state of Missouri. Second, although St. Louis metro area and Kansas City have the highest number of suicides, St. Louis City and Kansas City have the lowest suicide rate. Suicides are much more prevalent in terms of base rate in rural areas than in urban areas. In fact, we see this across the country. Rather interesting, suicide rates tend to increase from the lowest suicide rates are on the East Coast. New Jersey and New York battle back and forth to be the lowest suicide rate states. And then you tend to see the suicide rates peak as you head farther west, and they peak with our highest rates being in the mountain states. And I believe right now, Wyoming has the highest suicide rate in the country. Montana and Wyoming often take turns with that dubious distinction. Again, you can see here that majority of suicides in Missouri are between the ages of 25 and 64. And the other thing I'll point out in this data, let's go to the next slide because I think it does this better. We're higher than the rest of the country, and we are, in terms of firearm deaths, we're at 63% of suicides in the state of Missouri are firearm related. The national average is around 50%. So you can see that Missouri suicide rate is closely linked to firearm accessibility. And in fact, we are one of the highest states in terms of suicide death by firearm. Firearms do not make people suicidal. The problem with firearms is that the lethality is incredibly high. Survival rate, if someone attempts suicide with a firearm, is less than 10%, where with most other means, it's actually more like survival rates around 85%. So if people do attempt with a firearm, there's a good chance that they will not survive that attempt, right? So that's why firearm safety is a huge part of our statewide suicide prevention plan. We did a quick run through. I want to see if there's anything that we need to address in terms of kind of the overall epidemiology of suicide as it goes to the country, and also more specific Missouri data. It's really important when we're talking about suicide that we understand at a deep level what it means to be suicidal, to be experiencing a suicide crisis. Dr. Thomas Joyner, who is one of my heroes in suicide prevention, I agree with him on many things. There's things we don't agree on. He wrote an amazing book called Why People Die of Suicide. It's an incredible read. It's incredibly accessible if you want to learn more about this. Dr. Joyner's book, Why People Die of Suicide, is one of the best places to start. He talks about his father, who ended up dying of suicide when Dr. Joyner was an undergraduate. and it has a personal touch to it, and he does a wonderful job reviewing the data. One of the things that Dr. Joyner points out is that for those of us who don't struggle with suicide, we have to be aware and acknowledge that people who are struggling with suicide have a qualitatively distinct view of death compared to people who aren't struggling with suicide. Death has very different meanings and connotations to people. Most of us in the general public were frightened of death. Well, people at risk of suicide can be frightened of death too, but their relationship with death and their view of death changes as they move through the suicide crisis. So there's some things and some tools we use to understand this better. First is we have a theory that Dr. Joyner created. It's called the interpersonal psychological theory of suicide. What is it that differentiates people who try to kill themselves or die of suicide from those that don't? Now, this is really interesting. Anywhere between 15 to 30 million people in the United States of America have serious suicide thoughts at some point during a year. That was the stat we came up with. Post-COVID, there are estimates that during the COVID crisis, anywhere up to 50% of the population had significant thoughts about suicide. Yet the suicide rate went down. This is really important that we understand this. Suicide thoughts went up during COVID, but suicide behavior and suicide death went down. Why and how could we possibly explain that? Well, this theory actually does help explain that a little bit. There is a huge gap between having suicide thoughts and engaging in suicide behavior. It's a giant gap. In fact, we love that gap because that gives us a chance to intervene. Here's some things that the interpersonal psychological theory of suicide proposes. Belonging is absolutely key. Belonging is protective. When you feel like you belong, when you feel connected, when you feel you have a shared experience with other people, suicide rates go down. We'll talk more about that in a bit because I think it has some implications for pharmacists and the job y'all are doing. Burdensomeness, failing to thrive is key. One of the biggest distinguishing factors between someone having suicide thoughts who acts on those thoughts and someone who has suicide thoughts who doesn't act on those thoughts is a sense of burdensomeness or failure, right? When people are saying, I feel like a burden, I feel like people would be better off without me, that's a huge red flag. That's a really good sign that we need to be very direct in helping that person. Capability to harm self is acquired. Suicide is driven by mental illness. This is one of Dr. Joyner's theories. We're not going to spend a lot of time. I believe that that data does not support that, but we're not going to bore you with that. And Dr. Joyner talks about the derangement of self-sacrificial behavior. There is good evolutionary psychology evidence that in fact human beings at a deep level are hardwired for self-sacrifice. The classic example is in a tribe, a prehistorical tribe who is struggling because of famine or drought. Older or weaker residents would wander off and die of exposure to preserve resources for the healthier group. That there is a self-replicating, improved survival capacity and group behavior aspect to suicide behavior. Dr. Joyner believes that modern day suicide crises are a derangement of that instinct that we have to protect the group. Lots of debate about that, but it's interesting and worth talking about. So belonging, how important is belonging in suicide? Super, super important. We know that social exclusion triggers physical pain. One of my favorite studies demonstrated that when people feel rejected, the part of the brain that lights up is the same part of the brain that lights up if you hit them in the hand with a hammer. This distinction between physical pain and emotional pain is the most ridiculous artificial dichotomy human beings have ever created. Pain is pain. Now, we tend to be much more understanding of physical pain because we've been socialized that emotional pain is somehow a sign of weakness. And in America, if you're not happy, you're mentally ill. We have some really bizarre notions about the world, right? But we know that social exclusion triggers physical pain. We know that mothers and number of children is inversely correlated with suicide risk. The more children a mom has in her care, the less likely she is to kill herself. And each child adds a more protective factor. This doesn't mean that moms with children never attempt suicide. They most certainly do. It's just that it's much, much less likely, and the more children a mother has, the less likely she is to attempt because she feels needed and important. People depend on her. There's a connection between depression and disconnection from others. Depression isn't a very good predictor of suicide at all, to be quite honest. But when someone is depressed and isolating, that becomes more of a predictor. Living alone and a recent relationship loss are strong predictors of suicide behavior with someone who is struggling emotionally. And the divorced suicide rate is 3 times the married rate. All us married folks like to complain in a good-natured way about our spouses. We are much, much better off for our spouses. Marriage is a major protective factor across numerous health conditions, with suicide being one of the big ones. Burdensomeness, cultures of honor, these drive the suicide rate. When people ask what a culture of honor is, the best way I can explain this to you is that cultures of honor are typified by typical Southern and Midwestern rural culture. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The man is in charge and responsible for taking care of the family. If you cannot take care of your family, you are worthless. These are typical of culture of honor traits. We see them in other parts of the world too. It's not specific to the United States of America, but in a sense where it's a patriarchal society where the man is expected to provide, where a man's honor is on the line, that if you insult somebody, they are responsible to respond in kind and insult or retaliate. We tend to see suicide rates go hand in hand with cultures of honor. We imagine a rural Missourian whose farm isn't doing well. They're in tremendous debt, the crop fails, they have no safety net, they lose the farm, they can't take care of their family. This is a very high-risk population. That's why one of the groups is working on preventing suicide among farmers in Missouri, because there's a lot to unpack there. Social effectiveness and mental illness. As people are experiencing emotional pain, disruptions in their life, crises, or a mental illness, they have a harder time navigating social networks. They have a harder time leveraging social resources. They're not as good at helping people and meeting people and getting people to help them meet their needs. So we know that that plays a role in feeling like a burden. There's a strong relationship between burdensomeness and suicide thoughts. And burdensomeness successfully differentiates suicide deaths over and above almost all of their factors. When people feel like their death is more valuable than their life, we see bad things happen. I was involved in an insurance study with an actuary, and we looked at the suicide rate of people and their insurance policies. In the state of Missouri, suicide isn't covered for the first 2 years of your life insurance policy. Starting on year 2, if you die of suicide, your death is covered. The suicide rate skyrockets at year 2 of insurance policies, and it never comes back down. The suicide rate for people who have life insurance post the 2 years grace period remains about 3 to 4 times higher than folks in the first 2 years of their insurance policy, because people are making this idea that suicide's irrational is also a wrong idea. These are individuals that are making in their mind, very rational decisions that their death is more valuable to the loved ones than their life. And we need to intervene as quickly as we can in those situations. Higher pain tolerance and habituation. It's incredibly difficult to kill yourself, incredibly difficult. It is not easy. If it was easy to kill ourselves, the suicide rate would be 100 times what it is. People have to overcome a really strong life instinct. They have to be willing to harm their body. Sometimes people have to practice. The more attempts someone has had, the more likely they are to die of suicide. What we call high habituation groups have really high suicide rates. People with borderline personality disorder, people with anorexia have, in fact, people with anorexia are more likely to die of suicide than the health consequences of their condition. People who use intravenous heroin are 14 times the rate suicide to peers. And no, they rarely use heroin as a suicide method. Another huge myth that we really need to destroy. And there's a strong relationship between rehearsal and ruminative death. Look, it's really difficult to kill ourselves, and thank goodness it is, right? The idea that there's a strong association between high pain tolerance and suicide risk. The idea that people that try to kill themselves are weak, or they're babies, or they lack courage, it's the exact opposite. In fact, their pain tolerance is too high. Their courage level is too high. We really need to get those folks to actually not be so brave and reach out for help. Now, you've probably heard that pharmacists, or you've heard dentists, maybe doctors. We do know that there are some educated professional groups that are at higher suicide rate. I will tell you, I hate to burst your bubble on this, compared to construction workers, it's about 1/10 of the rate. Our highest rate, particularly our highest rate suicide work groups, are mostly uneducated labor force, particularly high construction jobs, lumber and wood, forestry work. Those types of folks have really astronomically high suicide rates compared to the professional class. Some of the professional class do have slightly higher suicide rates. I went down a rabbit hole to try to figure out how good this data was about pharmacists being at higher risk for suicide. The data is horrible, y'all. The best I could come up with is there's some estimates that the risk is about 1.2, 1.3 times the general population, so a little bit higher. But there's tons of professions in that range. I couldn't tell you right now. I would tell you that I don't think necessarily that pharmacists are at any higher risk than any other profession. What we do know, and this is important, we see similar rates of depression and suicide thoughts in pharmacists as to MDs, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is. Higher levels of anxiety. But one of the things, MDs, doctors are very reluctant to reach out and get help, right? Which is always amazing to me that the healers don't go get the healing, right? Not shocking to y'all. Pharmacists, y'all are really bad at this. Really bad. The MDs are really bad at reaching out and getting help. The data on pharmacists said that their rate of reaching out to get mental health services when they're struggling is about 1/4 of the docs, and the MDs are horrible at this. Not good news. So if there's anything you folks should leave with today is if you are struggling with an emotional issue, please reach out and get professional assistance. It works. It helps. The data on pharmacists suggests that it's really difficult for folks in the pharmacy field to reach out and get help. There's incredibly high levels of prejudice towards treatment by pharmacists. And this is really ironic because you folks are helping people fill their prescriptions for a big chunk of their treatment every single day. Yet the data on this shows that pharmacies and medical students are very reluctant to get help. That's something we need to fix, right? One of the things I like to talk about, one of the reasons that we have so much prejudice and bias against getting treatment is our language around people who are fighting mental illness or fighting suicide is incredibly pejorative. We use terms like commit suicide. Suicide isn't a sin, it isn't a crime. It stopped being a sin against God. I don't know when that stopped, but it hasn't been a crime for a long time. We don't say commit in front of anything else that's pleasant. We say commit fraud, we commit rape, commit crime, commit murder. When we're talking about suicide, we need to drop the commit. It's attempted or died by suicide. We talk about people being non-compliant with treatment when treatment isn't working for them, instead of focusing on the fact that this treatment isn't working for this person. We call people things like borderline personality disorder, access to, resistant, manipulative, gamey. All these things, we say reach out and get help, and then people reach out and get help, and we call them non-compliant, manipulative, resistant. So we've got a lot of double binds in our culture where we're constantly telling people, oh, please reach out and get help. Pharmacists are telling people, please reach out and get help. And then pharmacists aren't reaching out and getting help. Therapists aren't reaching out and getting help. So we need to be consistent in our messaging. We need to use client-centered language, people with thoughts of suicide, people who are in treatment, people who are depressed. And we need to use language that makes it and encourages people to engage services instead of using pejorative languages and terms for people who are trying to get help. For instance, saying someone is attention seeking, all help seeking is attention seeking. We don't need to label it in a negative fashion. In fact, labeling it in a negative fashion makes it less likely that people who should get help will get help. Friend of mine, Desiree L. Stage, who's an amazing photojournalist and suicide attempt survivor like myself. I am a suicide attempt survivor. You'd have no way of knowing about that from me unless I told you. Suicide can happen to anybody, anyone, anytime. No one is safe from suicide. No one's family is safe from suicide. And Desiree talks about how we get so focused on labels, diagnoses, we forget that people who are struggling with suicide are dealing with real existential life problems. It's important we talk about what's driving us towards suicide and not just treat things with labels. One of the things that we've instilled in our professional class and our populace to large extents is the idea that mental illness is this internal dispositional thing that is inside a person. We keep saying, well, how does mental illness impact our social structure? How does substance use impact our well-being? And it's the opposite. It's the exact opposite. It's how our social problems drive people to experience mental illness and experience substance use. We've got the cart before the horse. And in fact, the best evidence we have suggests that environment plays a much larger role in substance use and mental illness than any other single variable. And yet we still keep acting like this is something happening inside the person instead of a reaction to the world around them. So what do we do? Where do we go from here? After that quick run through about, hey, here's what the demographics of suicide look like. Here's theories that explain suicide. Here's some things that we know about what increases risk. Here's some things that we know about why people don't reach out to get help, and reaching out to get help is really important. First, we need to talk about that escapist ideation and suicide thoughts are often normal responses to severe stress and pain. In fact, one of my personal missions is to make it okay for people to realize that they have suicide thoughts and there's nothing wrong with them because they're having suicide thoughts. Suicide thoughts are incredibly common. Most people at some point in their life will have a significant suicide thought, right? And very few of them will act on those thoughts. When people are under intense pain and stress, when they're feeling pinched and they're not seeing an easy way out, this idea of escape, I just want this all to go away. I just wish I could get out of this situation. I wish I could go to sleep and not wake up. These are really natural thoughts, right? Very, very, very few people have those thoughts go on to attempt, let alone die of suicide. However, if I'm in a place where I'm having suicide thoughts, that's a good sign that something's not going well, that my natural coping systems aren't working well, or that my environmental stressors are overwhelming my natural coping strategies, and I should be proactive, right? Having suicide thoughts is normal. Being able to talk about those suicide thoughts is incredibly protective. There was a great study that looked at, it was actually a study in the Netherlands. There are parts of the Netherlands where people speak German, and there's parts of the Netherlands where people speak French. And there are these two communities that are really close to each other, the French-speaking community and the German-speaking community. What was fascinating is their social demographics were very much the same. Their incomes were the same. Most of their lifestyles were the same, but the suicide rate was very different in one population to the other. The biggest difference the study found, the French speakers were much more likely to say, when I'm feeling depressed, when I'm having suicide thoughts, I tell my family, I talk about it. The German speakers would not do that. There is good evidence that, in fact, being aware that you're not the only one having these thoughts. Remember when I talked about COVID and why the suicide rate down went during COVID? It's because we had a shared experience. Everybody knew why everybody else was bummed out. Everybody knew why the world sucked, right? We had an easy explanation, and we also saw that everybody around us was probably going through the same thing. There was a recent study that came out and looked at the sociological impacts of suicide, and if you are in a community where a bunch of us are laid off, and we all know we're all laid off, we're in better shape than somebody that gets laid off in a group where nobody's getting laid off because they don't feel that shared sense of connectedness. This is why for pharmacists, my guess, and we'll hear Shelby talk more, you can feel very isolated in your jobs. And it's really important that you all are talking to each other about the stress and what you're going through so that you know that you're not going through it alone. You're simply not alone in all this. Look, there's 40 plus suicide deaths a year. Each death impacts hundreds of people. We know every year 4 or 5 million people are impacted by suicide, and that's just by death, let alone 1.5 million people attempt, millions of people having suicide thoughts. We're all touched by this in some way, shape, or form. There's over 1 million suicide attempts every year. That means over 1 million people are connected directly or indirectly to a suicide attempt survivor. I guarantee you have somebody in your network right now that's attempted suicide and you had no idea. We need to be talking about this. Everybody in this room, no one knows someone who's had a suicide thought at some point in your life, if you yourself hasn't had that thought. Helping requires understanding. Suicide is not caused by mental illness. It's not caused by bullying. It's not caused by media, music, video, or games. It's definitely not caused by talking about suicide. Suicide behavior is complicated. Understanding some things we do know can really help us help people. It's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. If you're having suicide thoughts, there's nothing wrong with you. You're a person who's going through some severe pain, and we need to understand what's going on in your life, where that pain's coming from. Tell us what happened. Tell us what you're going through. Suicide thoughts are incredibly treatable. In fact, we have wonderful treatments that are very effective. We can't treat suicide thoughts when people keep them to themselves. So again, this is important we talk about. So what are some quick steps? What's changed, what's new, what's different, right? If you're struggling or you know somebody's struggling, let's find out what's going on with them. What's the story there? Let them talk about it. You need to talk about it. Understanding our own story helps us gain perspective. Who can you talk to? Do it. You should have a network where you can reach out and talk to somebody. If not, you should be connected to a mental health professional. Peer support and check-in systems. We need to be looking out for each other. I just did a 2-day suicide intervention training with law enforcement mental health professionals. And one of the things we do at the training is check in. How are you doing? What's going on? How are you feeling? And when people are struggling, ask them about suicide. Are you thinking about suicide? Getting a good medical and physical consult. If you're struggling with suicide, it's really important that we also rule out that there's nothing medically going on with you. Therapy works. It works incredibly well. And there are 24/7 resources that are completely free to you. There is the Suicide Lifeline, which will soon be 988-800-273-8255. There are trained suicide prevention clinicians available 24/7 wherever you're at in the country. And if you want to text, I've got staff here at BHR after a tough shift, they text the crisis text line just to kind of decompress and process what they went through. It's really important you have these tools available to you when you need them. Self-care is hard work. Self-care is just not doing crap you don't want to do. And I'm so sick of the self-care movement and its naivete. Self-care is hard work. It's like physical therapy. If you sprain a bad ankle in physical therapy, you don't get that ankle better by not using the ankle for 4 months. That's not self-care. Self-care is going to the physical therapist, working that and doing your exercises every single day, right? Somehow we've got this idea of self-care is pampering. It's not pampering. Self-care is doing the work to take care of yourself, right? If you're struggling, behavior activation works. I am telling you, I'm 53, and one of my true joys in life right now, you might laugh at me, it's mopping. If I'm feeling really bad, I'll do a big house mop. There's something about cleaning up the floor that cleans out my brain. Maybe this only works for me, but there's lots of good evidence that getting physically active, short bursts of activity help distract us from emotional pain. It also breaks our tunnel vision, small steps. And finally, communication is key. Family and friends are never the cause of someone's suicide. Never, never. We cannot be responsible for assuring someone is safe 24/7, right? We can learn some things that will help keep loved ones safe. We want to increase belonging. So if people are struggling to reach out to you, love on them, accept them. People feeling like a burden, value them. If they are talking about suicide and they have means to do so, we want to get those means secured and away from them and make sure we're connecting them to as many people as possible. Acceptance equals talk. Talk openly and honestly about suicide. Ask about suicide. Thoughts about dying, going to sleep, and not waking up, just wanting to end it or be over are aspects of suicide thinking. When people are giving you final, I just can't take it anymore. This is too much for me. That's someone that's struggling. Engage them. Ask them how they're doing. If they keep sounding like that, ask them to think about suicide. It's important we talk about the why. Yeah, I want to understand why people want to kill themselves. People have valid reasons for killing themselves. Talking about those reasons often helps people find the reasons they're staying alive. Accept that someone is having suicide thoughts makes it easier to talk about. We want it to be easy to talk about. Here are don'ts. Don't panic. Someone who's talking about suicide is still connected to life. Don't minimize reasons, negate or ignore the thoughts. Don't blow this off and don't tell them, oh, you'll get through this. They probably will, but the best way for to get through this is for us to lean in and for them to tell us what's going on. Don't give advice. Don't escalate or go straight to the hospital. If someone is talking about suicide but they've not taken action, our best option is to understand more before we do anything. Don't turn the conversation to positive things unless they bring those things up. You cannot sunshine and rainbow somebody out of a suicide crisis. The top 10, these are some of the top 10 tips for folks about how to get people to talk about suicide and things you shouldn't do. Things not to say. How could you think of suicide? Your life's not that bad. Imagine if you're about to kill yourself and this is what your friend tells you, right? Don't you know I would be devastated if you killed yourself? So guilting people doesn't work. Suicide is selfish. It's not. Suicide is cowardly. Not true. You don't mean that. You don't really want to die. They very much may want to die. You have so much to live for. Somebody who is so close to killing themselves that they're telling you that might not feel like they have a lot to live for right now. Things could be worse. Again, not helpful. Other people have problems worse than you and they don't want to die. That'll make the person feel better. Suicide's a permanent solution to a temporary problem, maybe the solution to the problem at hand, and we don't want that. You'll go to hell if you die by suicide. By the way, these are all things that people have said to suicide people over the years, and those of us who have struggled with suicide crises will tell you, hands down, they're horrible. Do listen, listen, listen. Acknowledge their pain and reasons, validate them. Ask them what keeps them going, keeps them from suicide. Ask yourself this if you're struggling. Let them know you care. Let them know you have hope, even if they don't. Ask what you can do to help. Here's a list of things that are really helpful to say. I'm glad you told me. I'm sad you're hurting. Tell me about what's making you want to die. When do you think you'll act on suicide thoughts? What ways do you have access? Help is available. What can I do? I care about you. I hope you'll keep talking to me. These are all things to keep the door open and keep the person talking. You don't need to be a therapist to help. What we're talking about is not therapy. These skills can help when needed. If you forget almost everything else we've talked about, don't forget this. Talking about suicide with someone openly and honestly saves lives. All right. And now's a good time for breathing, Shelby. Are you ready?
Yes, that was great, Bart.
Let's see. I know I rushed through, but I wanted to give you time. How do I stop the sharing?
I'm trying to share.
Let's see. There should be.
Shelby is taking over now, Bart, I think.
Oh, okay.
Okay, great. Okay, so I've been working with Bart on this presentation for a little bit, and I was asked to kind of give the pharmacist perspective of this, and I think it would be kind of dishonest to admit that right now my perspective after hearing all of that information is that I need to take a break and take a breath. So I would invite you to do the same. And this is a lot of information, and I know that as pharmacists, we're perfectionists, we're leaders, we're problem solvers. We have really high expectations for those around us, and we have even higher expectations for ourselves usually. But I want to remind you that no one expects you to be perfect with this, especially in this setting. Every time it might be a little bit differently when you're broaching this subject. Just remember that you don't have to be perfect. And I know that as a pharmacist, it's a very hard thing to hear that there's no exact right answer or single cure to the problem or the pill that is the first line treatment option that will work and cure your issue. And I know that I'm no exception to that rule. We want to figure out the problem, we want to find the answer, and we want to fix it. And whether it's by design or by some nature of those characteristics that make us such a great pharmacist, I know that I feel like at least a lot of the time I've positioned myself in this balance between myself and then making sure that all of these other areas are okay. I have responsibility for my patients and my family and my friends, my technicians and interns, other colleagues, students that we take on rotation, your businesses and your other colleagues that you work with day in and day out. And just looking at this scale, this can be incredibly challenging in the very best of times. And I know that the climate of pharmacy today is not the best of times most of the time. And then we decided to add a pandemic on top of it. And we all know where a large portion of the burden goes for getting millions of people vaccinated against this very serious virus. So I know how easy it can be to become overwhelmed and discouraged or disheartened just by looking at this. And hearing all of this information is so great, but we really want to make sure that you don't just add this to the other side of that scale and pile it on. It's not meant to add to your burdens. What I want you to think about, and if you came to this webinar, I'm hoping hearing the topic of it that you're thinking about ways that you can integrate things into your life and maybe shift this focus to remember that we did become pharmacists to try and help people, but we do also have to take care of ourselves. So if you shift a little bit, you'll kind of realize that a lot of those things that make us great pharmacists that I talked about earlier really put us in this optimal position to be connected with so many different people. And again, we are not responsible for everyone else around us, but we are in a great position to open these lines of communication. And you have to remember here that we do often fall as pharmacists, fall in the center here. We're perfectionists who have this amazing attention to detail. We're naturally inclined to notice when small things are off. This makes us the perfect person for this center focus that has a lot of connections and a lot of ways to make an impact. So you're primed and ready if you're willing to treat this more as you have the opportunity to start these conversations as opposed to this becoming just another burden on your plate. So if you're ready to kind of think about some ways to help and maybe help yourselves as well, I hope. I know that it's hard when there's no distinct answer, but Bart gave a lot of great recommendations, and I would just encourage you to try something new. Maybe go to that do's and don'ts slide or the things that can help and reread those a couple of times and pick one small thing to start out with. And it may feel kind of awkward at first, but the small things really do matter. Even just trying to talk about self-care or trying to talk about how you're doing, how you're feeling, it might open the doors for other people to feel comfortable. It at least shows that you care, that this is important, that people's well-being matters. So when you're in your pharmacies, maybe think about trying one new thing. And I can give a very tiny example that I can think back now and realize how impactful it was. But when I was an intern during pharmacy school at a retail pharmacy, every day I would show up for my shift, and then at the very end, the pharmacist that I worked with would always make a point to say, "Thank you so much for coming in today for your shift." And I'm sure the first few times she said that to me was kind of awkward, because I gave her a look back like, I was on the schedule, I get paid for this, I didn't really know it was optional. But her thanking me was her way of showing that she valued me and that I belonged and that I had a purpose there. So it really, even though at first it was slightly awkward, she opened that conversation up at the end of every day. And on the hardest of hard days, where we were really challenged and running ourselves ragged all day, we still got to the end of that day, and that same sentence came out of her mouth: "Thank you so much for coming in today for your shift." And then that really was when I needed to hear it. Those were the days when I was super disheartened, and those were the days when that statement really, really made an impact. And thinking about it now, those were also her hardest days too. But because she had practiced that simple sentence when times weren't critical and when it was easy to throw out at the end of the day and maybe didn't seem as impactful to me, it made it easier for her to be able to communicate and open up those that open discussion with me at the end of the day when things were really challenging for her as well. So that's something super simple. If you're ready to take things to the next level, or maybe you have a technician or an intern with you that could look into this a little bit more if you're at a busier pharmacy, we have a whole well-being policy within our PGY2 psychiatric pharmacy residency program. I'm a preceptor within that program, and we have our residents meet with our program director and do a formal rating scale on burnout every quarter. That gives that opportunity for them to maybe write things down, which could be a little bit easier than saying it out loud if they're not a super verbal or ready to talk about things. But it gives us a place to start of where to maybe somewhere they rated a little higher, maybe that's the conversation we start with and start to kind of pull out and make sure that we are heading in the right direction if the resident is experiencing burnout. And then, like Bart said, and I think this is so important for everyone, self-care is not easy. It's not meant to be. It serves a purpose, so it takes some effort. While we have our residents on rotation, part of this well-being policy is that every new rotation they have, they pick a house rule and a self-care skill. And so we will teach them, maybe the house rule might be Feedback Friday, or it might be a 30-minute dedicated no work lunch break every day. And those might not be things you can implement in your pharmacy, but kind of come up with things that might be able to do. Self-care skills are usually done after they go home, such as meditation or exercise. And then the most important part of this is while they're on rotation with us, we help them learn how to integrate these self-care skills and these house rules that we call them into their daily life. And then when they start to get busy and it starts to fall off of their radar, and maybe they didn't meditate for the last week. And then we all know how that ends up becoming, you don't exercise for a couple days, then you don't for a week, and then you don't for a month, and then it's been years since you've done these activities that you really enjoyed and that really increased your well-being. So we help them stay accountable, and then help them learn how to modify it or how to adjust their schedule and figure out ways to prioritize it. So our goal isn't really to help them find these skills that are good for them, because usually you kind of know what helps you out more so than anyone else does. But our goal is to help them learn how to prioritize them and how to not let them fall off the radar and identify how important it is. And then additionally, at each rotation, we try and encourage people to change it up and try something new. And usually whatever the resident picks, I pick with them for that month. So I'm always trying something new. And sometimes you learn things that don't work for you. And that's a really important discussion to have too, about things that aren't good for you. I learned that 30-minute dedicated lunch break where I don't work is not good for me. That increases my anxiety. But I learned that if I change it up a little bit and make it, I still close my door for 30 minutes every day, and I work on projects for the future so that I know that I'm working towards my long-term goals too, instead of just drowning every day and trying to keep my head above water in the pharmacy. Because you can get so absorbed in those day-to-day tasks. And that has really helped me make sure that I know I'm working towards bigger and better things for myself in the future. So those are just two ends of the spectrum of different ways to implement things. I certainly would encourage you to implement them for yourself as well, not just for those around you. But just remember, it's not your responsibility to hold everyone up, but your skills and natural characteristics do put you in a really good position as a pharmacist to really open up those lines of communication and make a huge impact. That is just a brief pharmacist perspective. And I believe now we can take any questions.
Yeah, I'm going to take control back from you there, Shelby. If anybody has a question for Bart or Shelby, you can send it to them via the GoToWebinar toolbar, type it in and hit send. Just a reminder, Bart and Shelby, you can see the questions on under the question tab on your toolbar.
So while everyone is reviewing questions, I thought I'd respond to one of the questions in the question box. And so someone has asked, what is the board doing to address pharmacy working conditions? And I'm summarizing that may play a part in pharmacists' mental health or well-being. This is a topic, pharmacy working conditions is a topic that's been on the board's agenda for several months now, at least for the last year, even before the pandemic. For those of you who may not know, the board has formed a pharmacy working conditions task force to look at specific areas. We understand that the stress of pharmacy may be contributing to what we see on the mental health level at pharmacies every day. And so the board will be looking and studying this topic and looking for best practices to help address some of the working conditions issues. The board also issued a working conditions statement that is on the board's website, and will likely be issuing some additional guidance in the future. Also, we have some suicide and mental health awareness resources in our last newsletter. We would encourage everyone, some of those were shared today as well. We'd encourage everyone to look at those. Tom.
Shelby or Bart, there was one question, Shelby, I think that might have been directed to you. Are you able to see that?
Yes, I am. I believe the question that you're referring to is, what burnout scales do you utilize for residents? And there's several different resources that are available. I'm trying to find the exact one that we grabbed and then modified for our program. But I'm only finding the one that we have printed out and used. So I don't have the exact resource on hand, but I can keep looking for that.
And then I don't, Bart, are you able to see the questions? There's one asking, is there any group that did increase in attempts during 2020 COVID?
It's a wonderful question. So we did see some increases in Black Americans in Chicago and in Maryland. In fact, Chicago during 2020, Black Chicagoans had almost a triple-fold increase in suicide deaths. I want folks to be really cautious about this though, because keep in mind, there are literally 300 million people in the United States of America. There are thousands of cities. So seeing increases in a couple of different regions could just be completely random, right? That we know that when numbers are small, you can see changes rapidly. There are counties in Missouri that will go from, drop a third of where they were and go to 5 times where they were the year before. So we did see some. The Maryland data is being questioned. The Chicago data looks really solid. Why would that be? Lots of speculation about that. Interesting enough, the suicide rate of Black St. Louisans did not go up during COVID. So yes, there were some pockets of increases. I expect where the suicide rate will see pockets of increases as we get back to normal. There are going to be groups that were more impacted by COVID that don't recover as quickly. And I think if those groups aren't connected and supported, that we could see some increases there. But that's just speculation at this point.
And I just looked up a little further into the rating scale, and primarily where we get a lot of our resources for burnout in regards to our residents that we utilize for other pharmacists as well is through ASHP. They do have a whole work group now on resident burnout specifically, and there's some great resources there. And I'm trying to send the answer with a link. And I'm not sure that it's going through.
If that doesn't work, I can give you their contact information and you can send it afterwards, Shelby.
I think it just went through.
Okay.
Dr. Lang, Dr. Andrews, I have a question. You mentioned self-care being something that's intentional. Can you give us just some more information about what intentional self-care really is?
So I can speak to that just a little bit. As far as the intentional versus unintentional, I think more of what it's getting at is self-care tasks aren't always just taking time for a bubble bath and relaxing when you have a lot of other things to do, but it's doing the things that actually help you recharge. So like Bart said, mopping the floor helps him kind of reground and gain a sense of focus forward. For me, it would be exercise and yoga. And I can tell that when yoga doesn't just happen naturally for me, I have to actively get up and make a point to carve out that time in my day to do that activity intentionally to ensure that I get what I need to recharge and keep my well-being high. Yoga doesn't just happen to me.
Yeah, that's perfect, Shelby. I mean, if you look at the research on cognitive behavioral psychology, on positive psychology, all the data tells us that these things require work. When we're stressed and overwhelmed, one of the things that we do is we engage in escapist behavior, which is shutting down, not doing things, isolating. we might get some immediate relief from that. The problem is that as we do more and more of that, our activity buffers get weaker and weaker. And so it's important that in terms of being intentional, that we do things so that we're doing them and we keep those muscles active, whether they're brain muscles or body muscles. And so that's why I use the physical therapy model. Sometimes self-care isn't pleasant, right? Making sure that you've got a routine and you're cleaning up after yourself, or you're taking care of things. When we're stressed, we often decompress and disconnect. And the more of that we do, often the harder it gets to do the things we need to do to take care of ourselves.
Well, we have unfortunately have run out of time. There was a couple comments about this being a great talk and a excellent program. I would have to agree with that. We want to thank Bart and Shelby. Very, very good presentation today. So before we close out, just a reminder, we do record our webinars. We've had 6 other ones this year so far. You can find on our website. For continuing education, if you're you want to collect CE for this, do not close your browser. Wait till a little screen comes up that says that I've ended the webinar. Click close. Again, do not close your browser, and a survey will open. Answer the questions and click submit. Should you not get the questions that open up, you can email us at compliance@pr.mo.gov, and we'll send you the questions by email, and you can return them within 24 hours. We will email certificates out in approximately 30 days. A reminder again, we do not report to the CPE monitor, so you need to save your certificates. And again, I want to thank Bart and Shelby for the excellent program today. And I am now going to end the webinar.